Hi guys, it's Mrs. Wallace. I just wanted to take a few more minutes with Monopsony and go over some of the questions that you got in class because we just didn't have a chance to really go over it in class and give this as much time. Remember that the Monopsony model is very, very different than perfect competition, where perfect competition in the factor market is demonstrating that there's a great deal of competition amongst firms to hire that particular factor, whether it's workers or to rent machines or whichever. In the Monopsony, we have a single buyer, so it's the only game in town. It's the only employer for 100 miles, and so it has particular advantages. And very much like the monopoly model, this is a model that gives the firm certain advantages. Like the monopoly can price higher than perfect competition and can underproduce and has dead weight loss, the Monopsony model is very similar. We see that the firm that is hiring factors is going to hire fewer factors in a Monopsony market, will actually have a wage that's lower than perfect competition, and will also have dead weight loss, is not going to be allocatively efficient, but rather is going to be profit maximizing. So just to remind you what's different about this model of the Monopsony, if there's only one graph, the firm is the market, and we have an upward sloping supply curve. So if this was the market for, say, computer scientists, the more the wage were to increase, the more we would see a quantity increase of individuals who want to supply their labor in this labor market. The marginal resource cost, however, is greater than supply. Every single time, because the firm has to always increase the wage in order to get more workers to actually be hired, every single time they want to hire another worker, they have to follow this upward sloping supply curve. They have to increase the wage. When they do that, they're going to go back and increase the wage for all of their workers. So if they have 20, computer scientists who are already making a lower wage, when they go to hire the next computer scientist, they may increase the wage for all of the workers. So the marginal resource cost is always going to be greater than the wage. And so we get this model that's very, very much like a mirror image of the monopoly model, except now we have MRC is greater than the supply curve. There's a couple of things about this. First of all, where is the firm going to produce? Always follow where MRC equals MRP. And in the case of the firm, they're actually going to produce the quantity QE, that's where MRC is equal to MRP, and the be able to hire workers at the wage of WE using the supply curve. They don't have to use the wage that's all the way up here, because they know in order to get this quantity of workers, they can follow the supply curve and pay this wage, okay? If we were actually to look at this as a perfectly competitive model, we would imagine that MRC is completely absent, right? And the supply curve in the market is upward sloping. This would also be kind of the wage, and the MRC would be the same. So the perfect competitor would actually be producing would be hiring a greater quantity of workers, greater than QE, okay, where MRC is equal to MRP, or where supply is equal to demand. And we would also see a much higher wage in this market. Perfect competitor would be able to hire at this equilibrium wage, right, in the perfectly competitive market, not the firm. So whenever you hear perfect competitive market, think upward sloping supply, downward sloping demand. We have the quantity of workers here in the market for computer scientists, and the wage here in the market for computer scientists. So very, very different perfectly competitive market than Monopsony, okay? And we can kind of imagine if the Monopsony was perfect competition, what that would look like. The other big takeaway with Monopsony is that the minimum wage discussion can be considered a little bit different. The minimum wage, and this is a perfectly competitive factor market, supply of resources, demand for workers, right? So supply of workers, demand for workers. And if we put the minimum wage as a price floor above the equilibrium, we have an issue, right? So the perfectly competitive factor market originally was hiring workers Q1 and the wage was W1. With the minimum wage, wage, we're going to have a higher wage, right? Because now by law, it's going to be binding. Nobody can have a wage that's lower. No firm can pay a wage that's lower. But the demand on the firm side, right, is going to be lower because of this mandated higher wage. So we have an issue once we pump up the wage, we kind of have essentially a surplus of workers, right? We have Q3 quantity of workers who want to supply their labor at that higher, dollar amount, the higher wage. But the firms are saying at that higher wage, forget it, we're only willing to hire Q2. So to some degree, you have a surplus of workers. What we could describe as kind of workers who are ultimately going to be unemployed would be the difference between Q3 and Q2. So, minimum wage has some benefits. All of the people who are hired up until Q2 are going to be making a higher wage. So for some individuals, there is definitely an increase in the wage, and that can be very useful. But a lot of economists talk about if the model is a perfectly competitive market, we run into kind of what's typical in a situation of a surplus where what's produced is going to be not allocatively efficient. We're no longer at Q1 where marginal benefit and marginal cost would intersect. We're actually getting a little bit of dead weight loss right here because this is a market that's going to actually hire the quantity of workers Q2, right? So the economists tend to be a little bit concerned about a minimum wage that might be very, very, very high, way up here, because of this problem. The counter argument to that, and this was developed by Alan Kruger some years ago, he's a Princeton economist. Unfortunately, he committed suicide earlier this year, kind of a huge shock for the economics world. But in any case, his theory is that if you actually had a monopsony, the whole relationship between minimum wage and unemployment would be really different, okay? So this particular graph looks a little bit confusing. Here we have our, let's look at our MRP. This is our demand curve. Here's our supply curve, right? So, a perfect competitor, this is where they might be. But the monopsonist has not only this upward sloping supply curve, it also has this marginal factor cost, or the marginal resource cost that's greater than supply. So the monopsonist, kind of working as a monopsonist, is going to hire labor where MRP equals MRC, okay? So we're going to get this quantity, the labor quantity for the monopsonist, okay? And ultimately they will pay the wage of $4, okay? And that is something that would be lower wage than perfect competition. It's also a lower quantity of labor hired than perfect competition would be, okay? If we pump up the wage to $5, okay, what happens in this case, because before the wage was LM, this $5 minimum wage is going to be a price control that completely takes out, essentially, these parts of the marginal factor costs and the supply curve are kind of irrelevant because now the firm can only pay a minimum of $5. So it doesn't matter how many people are willing to work for $4 or $3 or $2. It's irrelevant because we're only interested in the supply curve. It's kind of, this is now almost like the new marginal resource cost curve all the way up until it smacks into the supply curve. As soon as you get to the supply curve, in order for the firm to hire beyond L1, they would actually have to increase the wage, okay? So you kind of have a $5 wage, a $5 wage, a $5 wage, a $5 wage until boom, in order for the supply curve to actually be upheld, right? The actual workers are not going to, beyond this quantity, work for more than $5, okay? What does that mean? Well, if the wage is set at $5, we have a new place where MRC is equal to MRP, okay? Before, the monopsonist, right, was going to kind of find its quantity here at LM. That's how many workers it would hire. Now, with the minimum wage, they're actually going to increase the quantity of workers. So the dead weight loss is actually going to be smaller. There's actually going to be, it's not quite the same thing as perfect competition, right? With this $5 minimum wage, we have this kind of surplus thing that's going on, but compared to the monopsonist, which was actually hiring very little in the way of workers, now we see less deadweight loss and more workers hired. We're closer to allocative efficiency, okay? So this ends up being, if we argue that a minimum wage is kind of placed on a monopsonist, it could be that you don't have more unemployment, you could actually have less, okay? Because now you have a greater quantity of workers actually hired, kind of closer to what might be seen later. The other thing is we have not only do we have this quantity of workers at L2, okay, we also have at this quantity a higher wage, right? Everybody who's working at this quantity is getting a $5 wage, rather than before we had the monopsonist giving a $4 wage, okay? So that is perhaps key. And the way in which the marginal factor curve would look like, or the marginal resource cost would look, is kind of down, right? And normally your marginal factor cost would be here, but because we have this $5, $5, $5, $5, at this point we kind of have back our supply curve and also our marginal factor cost curve. So marginal factor cost curve would look like to here, then up, and then up here. Because once we have an upward sloping supply curve beyond L1, we also have in swing a marginal factor cost that's above supply. Okay, so these two are only going to begin at labor quantity L1. Okay, so if we go over to the homework, okay, kind of look at pulling this up. Let's see if I can, oh, here it is. See, here's my little PDF, okay? What would be the answers to this? So the senator opposes a proposal requiring monopsonists pay a minimum wage of at least M, saying that even if the labor market is monopsonistic, economic theory unambiguously demonstrates imposing a minimum wage causes employment to fall, okay? So we know that's incorrect, right? It's not always the case that employment will fall, there'll be greater unemployment if the effective MRC curve becomes this, okay? A, B, C, D, you're going to have the firm actually choosing to hire more workers from L1 to L2 following the imposition of the minimum wage. In this case, the minimum wage here actually puts the wage, the binding wage, at what would be the perfectly competitive wage, okay? So you kind of have, this is your marginal factor cost, okay? A, B, C, D, okay? In any case, and there's no deadweight lost in that version. Here in this table, assume a monopsonist has the marginal revenue product, okay? So I filled out the chart. You have a couple of things. This is the actual number of labor units, so next worker, next worker, next worker. The MRP of labor, okay, which serves as the demand curve. In this case, we have a wage rate. The wage rate is the supply curve, and because we know it's upward sloping, we know that this is going to be a monopsony. If I was looking at just demand and supply, and I didn't have to worry about a marginal factor curve, I would know in perfect competition my wage would be 13, and my workers hired would be 5, okay, because that's where my demand curve and my supply curve kind of intersect, okay? But in a monopsony model, because I have this increasing or upward sloping supply curve, that direct relationship, I know that I'm going to see my marginal labor cost or my marginal resource cost is going to also be upward sloping and will be greater than supply, okay? So my marginal labor cost is always going to be greater than the actual wage rate, okay? So if I look at this particular data, okay, and the marginal labor cost is just the change in total labor cost over the change in the number of workers. If I look at how many units will the firm hire, what will be the wage rate? If I look at this as a monopsony, I know that MRP and MRC are equal at 15. So If this is a profit maximizing monopsonist, they'll hire 4 workers, okay? What will be the wage rate? It'll be $12, okay? If this was perfect competition, they would actually not have this entire marginal resource cost. The labor cost would not exist, and we would just be using the demand and the supply curve. The wage would be 13, and the quantity of workers hired would be 5, okay? For this one, which is your AP problem, Woodland is a small town. Everybody works for Tremart. Tremart is a monopsonist and a perfect competitor in the lumber market. Okay, so we have monopsonist in the labor market, perfect competition in the product market. Labor is the only variable input. The labor market for Tremart is given in the graph above. What is the profit maximizing quantity of labor for Tremart? I know that I'm going to be looking at where MRC, or marginal factor cost, is equal to marginal revenue product. That's the quantity of workers that should be hired, okay, 100 workers. What will be the wage rate? Rather than saying $20, this is a firm that has the luxury